On October 31st, 2017, Christians will celebrate the Protestant Reformation, where 500 years ago Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the wall of the Roman Catholic Church. It would become known as the day in which Protestant Christianity was born. On the very same day, October 31st, 100 years ago, in Beersheba, in what is now southern Israel, the British, Australians, and New Zealanders would win the Battle of Beersheba and end the Ottoman Empire's control over the Holy Land. Just 2 days later, on November 2nd, 1917, the British Balfour Declaration would promise the Jews a homeland in that very region. Are these events, occurring 400 years apart to the very day, coincidence, or are they connected? Let's investigate in Hype or Hope. You decide. Martin Luther's decision on October 31st, 1517, to publish a document citing a number of problems in the Catholic Church is widely considered to be the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. That document was centered around what was then the common practice of the Church to grant indulgences to its members for the sins they committed. Luther was not a priest, but a professor of theology in Wittenberg, Germany. For him, the tipping point in deciding to rail against this practice came after learning that his own archbishop was not only granting such indulgences, but selling them in order to raise money for massive building projects in Rome. Thus, the 95 Theses was born. However, Luther did not nail them to the door of the Catholic Church in his hometown of Wittenberg, Germany. He simply included them along with his letter to the bishop disputing the practice of indulgences as compared to Holy Scripture. Thus, 1517 has become one of the most important years in all of Christianity. Fast forward exactly 400 years later to that very day in 1917. The place, southern Israel. On the morning of October 31st, British General Edmund Allenby, with British, Australian, and New Zealander forces under his command, would begin a risky attack on the city of Beersheba, which was the stronghold of the Ottoman Turks and the key to the Holy Land. The battle began at sunrise, but with Allenby only making small progress against the city, and with time and resources running out, the Battle of Beersheba would become famous for a late afternoon surprise charge by the Australian light horsemen. Light horsemen were not considered to be cavalry, but infantry. Their tactics worked in regions with large open spaces. Light horsemen used the horses to ride quickly into a battle and then dismount and advance on foot, as would an infantry. In the afternoon of October 31st, the New Zealander forces took a key hill east of Beersheba, today called Tel Sheva. This was the very site in which Abraham dug his first wells in the Holy Land and made covenant with Abimelech. After that key hill was taken, the pathway was opened up for the Australian Light Horse Brigade southeast of the city. In the late afternoon, with their horses becoming desperate for water, the Australians made a daring attack on Beersheba, but not to dismount in the typical style of the light horsemen, but rather to continue charging with their horses into enemy fire, not stopping until they reached the city. This surprise move overwhelmed and ultimately defeated the Ottoman Turks in Beersheba and won the battle for the Holy Land. Meanwhile, back in London, the Prime Minister's cabinet was not aware of the outcome of the battle and was drafting a statement of intent to use its best efforts to allocate in the Holy Land a permanent homeland for the Jews. The actual proclamation was issued 2 days later on November 2nd and has become famously known as the Balfour Declaration. Is this coincidence? Or are these events somehow connected to each other in the perspective of God? This video will make the case for that connection, and then you decide. We propose the basis of such a connection is the relationship between Israel and the nations, that when God does something good for Israel, he does something good for the nations as well. If there is such a connection, then a reasonable question must be asked. What happened in the Holy Land during the year 1517, when Martin Luther drafted his theses? It turns out that 1517 was the year that Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, first captured Jerusalem. As one who respected the Jews and Jerusalem, he rebuilt the walls of the old city as we see them today. This pivotal event in the history of the Holy Land and Jerusalem occurred in 1517. The Ottoman Turks would then hold the Holy Land for exactly 400 years, not losing control until 1917 in the Battle of Beersheba. In just over 40 days more, the Ottoman Empire would peaceably surrender Jerusalem to General Allenby on December 11th. Is this 400-year period coincidence? Was there a divine clock running all those years? Was there a countdown, if you will? And if so, can we find it in the Bible? Yes. In Genesis 15:13, God said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years." Could it be that God in his providence decided to start the countdown for the return of the Jewish people to their land once the Ottomans took control in 1517? By 1917, that 400-year period of Ottoman control would come to an end when the British government took control. And simultaneously with that control came the decision to create a Jewish homeland. Indeed, the Jewish people were returning in increasing numbers for the last 50 years prior to that declaration. But what about the following objection? The Balfour Declaration was not a legal promise, but only a letter of intent with no boundaries and no agreement with any other parties. That would not happen for 30 more years. To this point, let us hear what Moses writes in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 40. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and at the end of 430 years to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. If we add 430 years to 1517, we reach 1947. And indeed, it was on November 29, 1947, that the UN passed Resolution 181 to establish a homeland for the Jews with its boundaries. That additional 30 years is symmetrical to the 400 years, because in the time of the Exodus it occurred earlier, whereas in the last days in which we live, it occurred later. And what meaning can we take for 2017, which is a full 500 years later than 1517? Can we find the number 500 in this very same pattern? Yes. Jews reason from the text that Abraham must have received the original covenant from God at age 70, which means that this year, 2017, corresponds to the year of Abraham's birth. What is the message for us? Could it be that God is highlighting for Christians the fact that Christian history does not stand independently, as it were, but is intricately connected with God's plans for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel? The pattern of events surrounding the Ottoman Turks taking Jerusalem, the Protestant Reformation, the Battle of Beersheba, UN Resolution 181, and the 500th anniversary. Hype or hope? You decide.